Hello! Today we're going to be looking at David Hume's argument against miracles. Hume was an 18th century philosopher who— Stop, that's quite enough, thank you. I'm afraid you don't get to talk about the subject anymore. I'm so tired of apologists routinely mischaracterizing Hume's arguments, so I'm sorry squared, but you'll have to do a different video. Okay, I'll tell you what. The interpretation of Hume's argument is actually controversial, so I won't interpret Hume's argument against miracles myself. I'll just look at different interpretations of his argument and evaluate these interpretations. We'll go from the strongest interpretation, where Hume is interpreted as making an incredibly radical claim, to his weakest interpretation, where Hume is interpreted as making a not radical claim. The strongest interpretation of Hume is that miracles cannot happen, or at least they never do. On this interpretation, Hume starts off by subtly assuming that naturalism is true and there are no supernatural entities, and then concludes that miracles are impossible. This interpretation makes Hume's argument really easy to reject. Hume's assumption of naturalism is unjustified, so the entire argument has zero force. It seems, however, that this interpretation of Hume really misunderstands his point. Hume's arguments aren't about what's possible. Is there a magical incantation that people could use to levitate cars? Hume doesn't talk about that. He doesn't care. What Hume is really focused on, it seems, is that when a person tells you that some miraculous event occurred, what would be the rational response? This brings us to our next interpretation. It can never be rational to believe a miracle happened, or at least not on the basis of testimony. On this reading of Hume, miracles may very well be happening, but you shouldn't believe that they are. You can have all the testimony in the world, but you still shouldn't accept miracle claims. Fortunately for us, we have access to modern probability tools that Hume didn't have to analyze this claim. This is going to be pretty abstract, but it shows that as long as you have enough testimony of at least mediocre quality, then you can conclude a miracle has definitely occurred. Say some people claimed that miracle M has happened. Let's call the fact that an individual is giving this testimony T. This little equation here can be read as, how likely would T be if miracle M had occurred? The other equation can be read as, how likely would T be if miracle M had not occurred? Now let's line up all of our alleged witnesses to an alleged miracle and call their individual pieces of testimony T1, T2, and so on to our nth witness Tn. The next step is to calculate the ratios between how likely it would be for them to claim a miracle had occurred, if it had actually occurred, by how likely it would be for them to make the claim if it had not occurred. For example, you may think that there's a 90% chance that Tim would tell you if a miracle had occurred because he loves sharing weird stories. But there's a 60% chance that he would tell you a miracle had occurred even if there was no miracle because he's known for his practical jokes. The ratio between these two values is 1.5. The idea here is that if the value of the ratio is greater than 1, then the testimony in question does count as some evidence that raises the probability that miracle M had really occurred. Now, if our ratios meet some reasonable criteria, then that means all these little pieces of evidence will inevitably add up, and there's going to be some number of witnesses n, such that you should be convinced by the cumulative power of their testimonies that a miracle has in fact occurred. This shows that testimony, in principle, has the power to make belief in the miraculous possible. But maybe the correct interpretation of Hume is that, while it may be possible in principle to prove a miracle has occurred, that has never actually happened, or at least no miracle central to a religion has been proved. On this interpretation, Hume is broadly evaluating the evidence of miracle claims to show they're so hard to prove that none of them to date have been sufficiently supported. The problem is that this would be practically impossible to show because evaluating a miracle claim involves looking at so many different factors. Broadly speaking, the evaluation of a miracle claim, or any claim for that matter, can be broken down into two basic parts. First, every claim has a prior probability. This is how likely or unlikely you think a claim is before looking at some evidence. The next part is the strength of evidence, how much the probability is raised by looking at some facts. Now, the prior probability about miracle claims is going to largely be based on your beliefs about God, and the strength of the evidence is going to largely be based on your beliefs about history. So a person's views on a specific miracle claim, like the resurrection for example, will just involve analyzing all the arguments for God's existence, all of theology, and all of New Testament scholarship and history. Going through all of that is a little beyond the scope of this video, but I think it's safe to say that there's enough different factors at work here that it's kind of odd to think Hume somehow vanquished all miracle claims single-handedly. There are so many different factors involved that you just can't construct a knockdown proof against all miracle claims. For example, Hume argues that eyewitness testimony is a weak form of evidence, and someone might be sympathetic to his reasoning, so they think the strength of the evidence for the resurrection is weak. However, the same person may have certain theological beliefs, like that self-sacrifice is the ultimate expression of love, and true self-sacrifice requires laying down your life and dying requires a physical body, so God, a supremely loving being, would probably take on a physical body and lay down his life. Thus, someone could still agree with Hume and think that the force of eyewitness testimony is really weak, but also believe that the prior probability of the resurrection is really high on totally other grounds that Hume had not considered, so they would still end up believing in the resurrection. Here's another example. Hume seems to think that a low prior probability should be assigned to anything that violates the laws of nature. For example, the law that dead people stay dead is a regularity in nature which is confirmed a lot. So a break in this regularity, like a resurrection, should be viewed as intrinsically implausible. But this logic breaks down. Every time I drop a pencil, it falls on the floor. This happens a lot. However, if one day I bring a pencil to a pool and drop it underwater, it will float upwards. This violation in the regularity isn't intrinsically unlikely because I believe that there's something, namely the water, which has the causal powers to violate the regularity. So mere regularities lose their evidential force if you believe in something which has the power to break this regularity. So when considering the regularity dead people stay dead, you need to factor in the question of whether or not there is something which could and would violate this regularity, which will require discussion of the arguments for God's existence and the theology behind his actions. To put it simply, Hume can't look at just a few factors, like the laws of nature or how testimony works, and therefore conclude that all miracles are a sham. It's a little more complicated than that. But maybe Hume wasn't trying to show that no miracle claim has been proven. Maybe he was just trying to show that proving miracle claims is really hard because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now, I think that this slogan is actually correct. If extraordinary claims means that the claims have a low prior probability, and extraordinary evidence is, well, just strong evidence. That I can completely get behind. So, if someone is trying to prove a miracle claim, what they'll either need to do is show that a miracle isn't intrinsically unlikely for theological or whatever other reason, or provide strong evidence to overcome this low prior probability by looking at history or whatnot. Preferably, a Christian argument for the resurrection will include both of these. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe or support me on Patreon if you enjoy this content.